Hi everybody, my name is Terry Gamble and I've been honored to be invited by McLean and Aiken to talk about their summer bundle series of books that I've written and books that I love. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own writing, and then I can talk about how these books were inspired by the writings of others. For those of you who are familiar with my work, you know that I love to write about families and about family history. I see family history as the microcosm that reflects how society is changing and evolving. And so I love to cover several generations when I write about a family. So my first two books were set in northern Michigan. The Water Dancers follows the life of a young Odawa woman named Rachel Winnipie as she goes to work for a summer family, and how those two families end up becoming intertwined. And that taught me so much about the culture of northern Michigan, and particularly of the indigenous people. My second book, Good Family, is really mostly the story of a summer family starting in the late 19th century who come to the area, and how their family, who loves this area so much, continues to come back to the same place, continues to come back to the same house, but changes and become different people from the people who originally settled here. In this spirit of family history, I started my last book almost a decade or so ago. This book is called The Eulogist. It is not set in northern Michigan, but rather it is set along the banks of the Ohio River, which is where they settled when they emigrated from Northern Ireland. They ended up there because that's where the opportunity was. They were immigrants, but they were immigrants of the sort that were welcomed in this country at the time. Scots-Irish, Protestants, white people, and English-speaking. America at the end of the 19th century really opened its doors to immigrants because it needed to build its population and to build its workforce. And the free states were expanding to the west. But interestingly enough, Cincinnati lies just across the Ohio River from Kentucky, which at the time, of course, was a slave state. So I got pretty interested in what was the dynamic between the free state and the slave state in such close proximity. What did the people of the time think about slavery? What did my family, or families like mine that were religious but hardworking, were they going to be involved in that issue, or was it not an issue that concerned them? I never completely determined my own family's attitude about slavery, but I learned a lot about the people who were trying to abolish slavery, and a lot about the people who needed to continue with the status quo and to coexist with slavery. So a number of issues came up for me in writing The Eulogist. Of course, I've already mentioned immigration and how one set of immigrants might be welcome, while the next set of immigrants that followed, say the Irish Catholics, as opposed to the Protestant Irish, were not so welcomed. And what were the biases of the time? I was also really interested in the role of women, and the story is told by a female narrator named Olivia Gibbons, who's very smart, but who gets a little frustrated with the limitations in her life. I learned about public health. I learned about the emerging technology at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine, for instance, the cotton gin. And I learned a lot about the religions of the time. There was a lot of religiosity in the years between 1820 and 1850, leading up to the Civil War. And it started to occur to me that many of the issues that we are litigating today were already being litigated in the 19th century. Race, women's rights, freedom of speech, religion, economics, technology, public health. So here in this summer of 2020, where we have been thinking so much about the pandemic and about Black Lives Matter and about our whole social contract, started to think about some other books that I have loved and wanted to mention and how they informed the Eulogist. One of the most famous books that you may all have heard of is by Toni Morrison, and it's called Beloved. Beloved is based on a true story, the story of Harriet Garner, her family escapes to freedom. She escapes to freedom while pregnant and is eventually forced to return to bondage. The book opens during Reconstruction, a failed Reconstruction, because Lincoln's been assassinated, Andrew Johnson is president, and this family is trying to make its way, but they are haunted. They are haunted literally and figuratively by a child who died and the tragedy of the circumstances of her death. And I think that Beloved is a must-read because it does tell you so much about that same area. In fact, Harriet Garner went to Cincinnati, just as my characters are set in Cincinnati, and as they too deal with runaway slaves or people that are buying their way into freedom. It's one of the most beautifully written books that I've ever read, and I think it's important to put the perspective on Black Lives Matter today is to understand the roots of slavery in this country. The other book is set in a much older time in medieval England, and that is a book called A Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks, one of my favorite authors. She also wrote March, and she wrote the People of the Book. I think that's right. But The Year of Wonders is about how a pandemic, in this case the bubonic plague, not fun, hits England, and how one village chooses to go into a quarantine and not let anybody in or out because they had so little medical knowledge at that time, but they knew there was something that was causing this contagion. And they knew that by not interacting with others, they could contain the disease until it burned its way through. And like the Eulogist, The Year of Wonders deals with the state of science at the time, which is not so great. It's a little primitive, but they were on the right track and people were trying to figure stuff out. And it also deals with religion and how religion was rising up in response to terrible human tragedy and to the threat of an evolving society that was changing rapidly. So I recommend bundling these three books: The Eulogist, Toni Morrison's Beloved, and Geraldine Brooks's wonderful book, A Year of Wonders.